Good morning. We are continuing with the NCERT concept series. We are focused on the class 7th history NCERT. It's named Our Past, and in the lecture 4 we are going to cover the Mughal Empire. So first look at the contents of this NCERT. See, in the first chapter we are looked into the changes through 1,000 years. We looked at two things: A, the sources for studying the changes, and B, some major trends that will be visible throughout the medieval period. Okay. Then we looked into the some important political and economic phenomena of early medieval period. We looked into the tripartite struggle and Chol Empire. Okay. Then we looked into the some of the features of the Delhi Sultanate in chapter 3, and today we are going to focus on the Mughal Empire. See, this is the contents of this chapter. First, we are going to look into the origin of the Mughals. I mean, where does the word Mughal come from? Where they came from? What were their aspirations and ambitions? Then we are going to the timeline of Mughal emperors, important political events, important battles, important successions, important administrative and social changes, etc. Then relations, what were their relations with other rulers like Rajputs, Marathas, Rajputs, Marathas, then the foreign rulers like Uzbeks, Safavids, etc. And then some important features of the Mughal administration, namely Mansabdari, which was organically linked to the land revenue administration. And then we will pay specific focus on religious policy of Akbar, especially his Sulh Kul, meaning universal peace. Universal peace. Okay. And then at last we will look into the decline of Mughal Empire. Normally, we pay more attention to rulers like Akbar and Aurangzeb precisely because of their monumental impact on the Indian society and the political changes of that period. However, since it's written for the 7th class students, so they have conspicuously chosen not to address some areas, and then they are focusing more on some other areas. We shall look into it while we study the chapter. Okay, first, why Mughals are important? See, often when we study about the Mughals, this charge is raised that why so much focus is given on Mughals and not some other dynasty or some other culture. So this is why we study Mughals, why they are important. Because Mughals created an empire and accomplished what had hitherto seemed possible only for short periods, of time, due to the diversity of people and vastness of geography. We know that up to the beginning of medieval period, different geographical regions had acquired distinct cultural identity. And when that happens, creating an empire becomes that much more challenging, because each region feels, a strong sense of, they want local autonomy. So they have this strong sense of independence, and creating a long-lasting empire becomes that much challenging. So whosoever tried to build an empire could succeed only for a small period. I mean, yes, Chola Empire and Vijayanagar Empire did last a very long period. But compared to the Mughals, their domains were definitely smaller. So we should keep these things in mind, that building an empire in the era of huge diversity and vastness of geography was a challenge which they met head on. Okay. And then compared to the other prominent empires of the period, often Mughal Empire, Uzbeks, Safavids and Ottomans are called gunpowder empire, because this was the era of gunpowder technology. Okay. The Ottomans, they ruled from modern day Turkey, and during their heydays they often knocked at the gates of Europe. Safavids, modern day Persia and some parts of Central Asia, and Uzbeks, Central Asia. Okay. Among all these, Mughal Empire was more impressive in every conceivable way, be it the military might, be it the wealth, be it the vastness of geography, be it the duration, or be it the population under its command. In every conceivable way, Mughal Empire lasted longer. Though this Turkish Empire and Safavid Empire did continue even after their decline and lasted very long, but we have to understand, for example, in the case of Ottomans, for last 2-3 centuries, their existence was entirely dependent on the mercy of European powers. So, in these ways, Mughal Empire was more impressive in every conceivable way. And what about the tolerance? The level of tolerance, barring a few hiccups here and there, the level of tolerance in Mughal Empire and religious diversity was much more impressive. I mean, this is the era of Ivan the Terrible. There was this Russian contemporary of Mughal Empire called Ivan the Terrible. This was the era of Spanish Inquisitions. This was the era of intense Shia-Sunni conflict across the world. So, in spite of those facts, the overall religious environment in Mughal Empire was far more, congenial. If I could use the word. Also, they imposed administrative structures and ideas of governance that outlasted their rule, leaving a political legacy. I mean, even when the Mughal Empire declined, even when the power of Mughal Emperor was considerably eroded, still, and when the new states came up, they decided not to overthrow at least the nominal sovereignty of emperor, because they had continued with so many of Mughal institutions, administrative practices, norms, customs, that at least nominally they accepted the sovereignty of Mughal emperor. Okay, many of in fact, when after the Battle of Buxar, when Robert Clive introduced the diarchy in Bengal, when he separated the revenue administration from general administration, he was actually in a way referring to how Mughals used to control a provincial government. This was originally a Mughal practice of separating the general law and order administration and the revenue administration. So such was the legacy, such was the memory of Mughal emperor, that even in 1857, when there was this rebellion, the first choice was the dilapidated Mughal emperor, because there was no one else who could call himself a natural leader of Indian people at that time. So such are the reasons. Also, Mughal legacy in art, architecture are humongous. I mean, you say Mughal architecture and the first name comes up is Taj Mahal, but there are so many other things, that the process of creation of a synthetic, or synthesization of a composite Indo-Islamic architecture that continued and flourished during the Mughal period. The give and take between different elements of the regional architectures. I mean, the features of Bengal School of Architecture were, incorporated in Fatehpur Sikri. The features of Gujarat School of Architecture incorporated there. So, such mixing and creation of something new kept happening throughout the Mughal period. And Mughal emperors, there is this less discussed legacy of Mughal emperor, that many of the Mughal emperors, especially Akbar and the Prince Dara Shikoh, they undertook translation of old Sanskrit works on such a vast scale that via Persian, the original Sanskrit works via Persian became available to many Western readers. I mean, just how many of us read Bhagavad Gita or Mahabharata in English today, because we cannot read Sanskrit. See, in a similar way, there were many people in Europe that read Indian scriptures in Persian, because they could read Persian, but they could not read Sanskrit. So their contribution in being a global ambassador of Indian culture is unprecedented and rather undiscussed. In fact, there was a question this year, actually, in this year's mains, though that will be discussed later in the chapter about the translation projects of Mughal emperors. Today, the Prime Minister of India addresses the nation on Independence Day from the ramparts of Red Fort in Delhi. I mean, why? Though now it's a tradition, so we don't question it. But why the tradition was started? It could be anywhere. I mean, the President's house is no less, magnanimous. It's vast. It's modern. It's still in use. There are so many monuments in Delhi from where you could do it. But why they chose Red Fort? Because Red Fort was a symbol of sovereignty. The colonial state was sovereign for a period, but it was never accepted by the people of India. But that was not the case with Mughal emperor. So it was, in a sense, trying an attempt to show continuity with the medieval period's sovereign. So for these reasons, Mughal emperors are important, and for these reasons, the history of Mughal Empire and the changes and continuities, changes that took place during that period and continuities from that period are very important whenever we are studying the medieval history of India. Okay, you cannot imagine the medieval history of India without Mughal emperors. Though it is true, there are many more things to the medieval history of India. You cannot say it is only Delhi Sultanate and Mughal Empire, but without Mughal Empire, it is very difficult to imagine medieval history. So first thing, who were the Mughals? Call us Timurid, not Mughals. Actually, Mughals did not call themselves Mughals for two reasons. A, the word Mughal reminded people of Mongols, Genghis Khan, and the unimaginable slaughter that is associated with the memory of Genghis Khan. Similarly, though it's a misconception that the word Khan in Genghis Khan's name comes from a chief. So he was often called Genghis the Great Khan, means the Khan of Khans, the chief, the leader of many tribes, leader of the leaders. It is only later that the surname Khan was adopted among Muslims. So Genghis Khan came from the steppes of Central Asia, precisely Mongolia. From that area, the Mongol Empire fanned out, and eventually it reshaped the history of world in so many ways. However, that would be a digression talking about the Mongols at this point. However, the point here is they prefer to call themselves Timurids, not Mongols, because Mughals, because the word Mughal reminded people of Mongols. It is only later I don't know whether it was intentional or unintentional or mischievous, if I may use the term. It was in the colonial period that the Mughals were, the word Mughals came up, because somehow they were, the early historians of this period were somehow keen on associating them with the memory of Mongols. But that is not true. They preferred to call themselves Timurids. Also, there was another Central Asian tribal group called Uzbeks. They also shared some connection with Mongols, and they were fierce rivals of Timurids. See, basically Timurids were descendants of Timur or Tamerlane from father's side, only 4 or 5 generations removed, and from mother's side they were descendants from Genghis Khan, but that link went way too far, like 15-20 generations, that far that link went. So their link with Timur was very recent, and the memory of Timur was very much accepted in the history of India. Okay, say you have two prominent persons in your ancestry, one from father's side and another from mother's side. Now the person from father's side is very famous, very widely acknowledged as a hero, so you would prefer to be associated with that person. Also, the person was very recent in father ancestry, but the person on mother's side was reviled for his violence and butchery and very far away in ancestry, 20-25 generations away. So they prefer to call themselves Timurids, that is the descendants of Timur, and not Mongols. So not Mughals, because the word Mughal see, look at myself, I am often confusing these two words, Mongols and Mughals, because such is the way they sound, they appear very similar. So anyone who says Mughal, they start making that link. So they did not like to make that link. They said, no, please call us Timurids. It is only the later colonial historians that made that mischievous connection. Also, Timur. Now, who was this person? He was originally from the Fargana Valley, from this current day Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan area, from this part of the world he was, and his capital was Samarkand. And in 1398, during the time of Tughlaq emperors, he attacked India and he came as far as Delhi. He captured it. He annexed Punjab region to his Timurid empire. Okay, and in fact, after Tughlaqs, there was this dynasty in Delhi Sultanate called. Let's do it here. He attacked India in 1398 CE, conquered Delhi, but he did not annex it. He annexed only as far as Punjab. Okay, and after Tughlaqs, the new dynasty, okay, called the Sayyids, they did not call themselves Sultan. They accepted the suzerainty of the descendants of Timur. The Shah Rukh was the descendant of Timur, and they accepted his suzerainty. They did not get coins minted in their name. They did not get their names read in their Friday prayers. In fact, the name of Timur's descendants were read in Friday prayers. Okay, since they could not call themselves Sultan, they adopted some other lofty titles, that the Lord of the World or the best of the best commander, something of that sort. They did not call themselves Sultan because nominally they were appointed by, or rather confirmed by, Timurid rulers. It is only with the Lodi dynasty that on one hand the Timurids had become weak in Central Asia, so there was no need to fear them anymore, and here the Lodis were themselves consolidating their rule. So after Sayyids there were Lodis. It was only with the Lodis that they again started calling themselves Sultan. And since Babur, who was a descendant of Timur, he was thrown out of his Central Asian homeland by Uzbeks. The Uzbeks that he detested, and he hated them because they were his fierce competitors. They also shared the Mongol blood. This was one of the reasons that the Timurid did not like to be called Mughals, because even Uzbeks were associated with Mongols. So they said, no, we don't want to be reminded of our shared, that these Uzbeks and us have a shared ancestry. So this Babur fought with the last Lodi ruler, Ibrahim Lodi. Okay. So this is the brief linkage, that Timur attacked Delhi Sultanate in 1390 CE, conquered Delhi but did not annex it, took war booty but annexed up to Punjab. In fact, the Sayyids that came after Tughlaqs, they accepted the suzerainty of Timurid rulers after that. It is only when the Lodis came to power, and by the time Timurids had become weak and fragmented, that they again started calling themselves Sultan and adopted all the paraphernalia of a sultanate, meaning getting your coins minted, getting your name read in the khutbah, etc. When Babur was displaced from his Central Asian homeland by the fellow Uzbeks, another tribe that also had Mongol blood in them, then he came towards India and he claimed that, look, since my forefather Timur had annexed Punjab, therefore, and I am the only surviving Timurid prince, so give me Punjab. And on that issue, he fought with Ibrahim Lodi, the last Lodi Sultan. So, call us Timurid, not Mughals. Why? Because the word Mughal reminds people of the word Mongol. Even I am myself, often mixing up the two words. And Mongols means Genghis Khan and the slaughter of massacre, all the bad memories. Also another tribe called Uzbeks, they are fierce competitors. They also had Mongol blood in them. They also did not want to be reminded of that shared ancestry. So they preferred to be called Timurids. And such was the desire to associate themselves with Timur, that almost every Mughal emperor got this painting made. So this is here Timur at the center, and this is here Aurangzeb. The last grand Mughal, this here. Now, it doesn't mean that they all sat down together, and since how many have been gone? This is Aurangzeb, this is Shah Jahan, Jahangir, Akbar, Humayun, Babur, and then some 4 more descendants between Timur and Babur. So see, there were at least 4 descendants between Babur and Timur. So that doesn't mean that they all sat down together to get a painting done. What it means that each and every Sultan, each and every Badshah of a Mughal empire, he preferred to be associated with Timur. In fact, there is this saying that Timur was given this title, Lord of Conjunction, meaning a person who was born during the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn. And it was Shah Jahan that called himself the second Lord of Conjunction. So such was the living memory, and there was always this desire among the Mughal emperors to reconquer their homeland, the homeland of Central Asia. See, here we have briefly given the political extent of the Mughal Empire. See the extent under Babur and Humayun, this part here, extent under the Akbar. However, it would be slightly misleading to think that when Akbar came to power, all this was under, was under Mughal control. Actually, if you recall, Humayun had lost of his kingdom, and when he regained it, he immediately died. And when Akbar came to power, there were again many disturbances. So he was basically removed to this Delhi, Agra, Ajmer region, and from there he expanded. Akbar is known for his tolerance, for his wisdom, etc. But perhaps most importantly, Akbar was a brilliant general, a very brave soldier and a brilliant commander. There are so many stories. Recently, a biography of Akbar was published. Okay, and first and foremost, he was a very good soldier, a great general. Then he was the other things for which he is famous for. And then we have given the addition under Aurangzeb. So you can see there were two main phases of expansion. One under, the ones that we are concerned with. One under Akbar and one under Aurangzeb. Okay. And then Aurangzeb took the territory right up to here. However, it was a very short-lived expansion. Just as you see the similarity with Muhammad bin Tughlaq. Muhammad bin Tughlaq had the same problem. He expanded the extent of Delhi Sultanate to its maximum. But the moment he reached the maximum, very soon everything came crashing down. Okay, he went on an expedition to quell a rebellion. The news spread that Sultan has died. Immediately all the southern territories revolted. Then, broken-hearted, he shifted capital back to Delhi. And when he died, rest of the empire, rest of the territories revolted. Gujarat, Bengal, Jaunpur, Malwa, everybody then went away. So the point is, if you stretch your empire beyond the limits of possible governance, then you are triggering a, very rapid decline. Major campaigns and events of Mughal emperors. See here, a caveat, since we have been repeatedly saying that don't bother with dates, don't bother with the exact chronology of events, you just see some important events. If you revise again and again, then some of these events you remember automatically. Just how we say about the articles of the Constitution, that you don't need to, cram them. You don't need to go through that, okay, Article 6, Article 15, Article 35. No. If you revise polity sufficiently, then you will automatically remember important articles. Similarly, if you revise history sufficiently, then you will automatically remember what you should remember. Okay. Here, so Babur laid the foundation of Mughal Empire, defeated Ibrahim Lodi at Panipat, Rana Sanga at Khanwa, and Rajputs of Malwa at Chanderi. Okay, so and he is also credited for effective use of cannon, but gunpowder technology was brought to India in the 14th century itself. Humayun struggled with, and very soon after this battle, he died. See, Babur had 4 able-bodied sons left out when he died. Humayun was his, heir apparent, and he told him that, look, be gentle with your brothers, but don't divide your empire. Okay. Now we will see the relevance of that, sermon in a short while. After him, Humayun struggled with Gujarat Sultanate, Afghans of Bihar and Jaunpur, his brothers, especially Kamran. See, where did these Afghans come from? Now, Afghans should be in Afghanistan. How did they reach to eastern UP and Bihar? See, what happened, if you recall, in last lecture we had said that throughout the period of Delhi Sultanate, there was a consistent immigration of Afghans into India, looking for employment opportunities and entrepreneurial opportunities, political power, etc. But especially during the Lodi dynasty, with the establishment of Lodi dynasty by Bahlol Lodi, he issued a farman, he issued an appeal to his kinsmen in Afghanistan that come, I don't have a support base here. You come here, we will share the wealth of India, only the kingship will be mine. So when he issued this appeal, the people of his kinsmen came like like locusts. Locusts were in news recently. See, Abbas Khan Sarwani says that when he issued this appeal, the people from his, this home province came in hordes like a locust. So this was the period when there was a very rapid influx of Afghans, and many of them got established in Bihar, eastern UP, in these areas. They were given jamindaris there, they were given iktas there, and they got entrenched. So entrenched that they were a headache for Mughals. Because see, how did Mughals come? First, they defeat Ibrahim Lodi, so they have removed an Afghan, so that is a bitterness. So later on, they became, and even Humayun, he fought his nemesis Sher Shah Sur. He was also an Afghan. So Afghans had a very complicated relationship with Mughals. It is only much later that they reconciled with Mughals, and then they were given some positions in Mansabdari. Though they never rose in the Mughal ranks as high as Rajputs or some other groups. So struggled with Gujarat Sultanate. When did Gujarat Sultanate come into picture? When Muhammad bin Tughlaq died, the governor or Iqtadar of Gujarat area revolted, okay, and Gujarat became separate. So, with the death of Muhammad bin Tughlaq, Afghans of Bihar, we just discussed how they came to India, and his brothers, especially Kamran. I mean, perhaps the most unfortunate thing to happen to Humayun were his brothers. I mean, time and again, they will, completely squander the gains made by him. They were bitter about him. They did not come to his aid when he needed them most. So, just as, we talk about the Shakuni Mama or such other relatives, there should be, the brothers of Humayun should be famous to that extent. Partly the reason Humayun was a failure was because of, if you consider him failure, though we will question that in a moment. But if Humayun was a failure, that was largely due to his brothers. Sher Shah Sur, the nemesis of Humayun, defeated him at Chausa and Kannauj. See, the story of the rise of Sher Shah Sur is very interesting. I mean, you could make a movie about it, though I doubt that how will you make him a hero of that movie. But it's a fascinating tale. A man of nothing. I mean, to say that he came from a humble background would be an understatement. A very cunning, very ambitious, very brave man. He came to the fore, led the Afghans that were, scattered, bitter with the Mughal Empire. He led them, all the Afghans rallied around him and they said, yes, defeat these Mughals. He defeated them, defeated Humayun not once but twice at Chausa. This is in Bihar now, and at Kannauj, very close to Agra. At this point, Humayun had to flee, and he eventually wandered around the country and then eventually went to Iran to the Safavid rulers. But see, before you declare Humayun a failure, remember, he is the only king who reconquered his entire dominion. Why? Because when Sher Shah Sur defeated Humayun and he fled, Sher Shah Suri established his, Sur empire. However, it was very short-lived. When Sher Shah Suri died, a few successors came. Immediately, the chaos disintegration followed, and that allowed Humayun to come back from Iran with a proper force, and then he recaptured Delhi. Okay. After him, but soon after his reconquest, soon after he died in his library, Akbar started from his base in Delhi Agra region and built an empire. Akbar was 13 years old when he became emperor. His reign can be divided into 3 periods. Which 3? First, again, you don't need to remember the exact chronology or which event happened exactly. Just read them properly. Akbar became independent of Bairam Khan and other members of his domestic staff. Now we all have seen Jodha Akbar, so you know what Bairam Khan's role was. Military campaigns against the Surs and other Afghans, kingdoms of Malwa and Gondwana. This Gondwana is, eastern MP Chhattisgarh area. To suppress the revolt of his half-brother Mirza Hakim and the Uzbeks. Mirza Hakim was a serious contender to his throne because he was his half-brother, another son of Humayun. And Uzbeks, they were, as we said, always a problem for Mughal emperors. In 1568, the Sisodia capital of Chittor was seized, and 1579, here the famous siege, this was the capital of Maharana Pratap. Okay. From here, the Maharana Pratap had to eventually leave, and then sometime later they had the monumental Battle of Haldi Ghati. In second phase, now since he has secured the routes to outer areas, here he has secured Gondwana, which gives you elephants, etc., kingdom of Malwa and other areas. So therefore now he is expanding outwards. Since you have Malwa under your control and Rajputana has been suppressed as well. So now he could go further go to Bihar, Bengal, Gujarat, Odisha. These campaigns were complicated by revolt in support of Mirza Hakim, again his half-brother. Then third phase, expansion of Akbar's empire. And these were really far in the far-off areas. Campaigns were launched in northwest. Kandahar was seized from Safavids. See, here the turn in relationship comes. His father Humayun had fled to the Safavids of Iran. But Akbar realized the strategic and commercial importance of Kandahar because it was a gateway to the trade with West Asia. Okay, Kabul was a gateway to Central Asia, but Kandahar was a gateway to West Asia. So he realized the strategic importance and he said, look, okay, you were very good to my father, but I need Kandahar. So, in fact, Kandahar was under Mughal control during the time of Humayun and his brothers. So this was not a new thing. As also Kabul after the death of Mirza Hakim. See, when he defeated Mirza Hakim, he did not kill him, he let him rule over Kabul. He just ensured that he did not threaten him again. But when Mirza Hakim died, he very peacefully annexed Kabul at that point. Campaigns in the Deccan started and Berar, Khandesh and other parts were annexed. Now even Kashmir was annexed during this period. Because now he is really expanding outwards and outwards. In the last years of his reign, Akbar was distracted by the rebellion of Prince Salim, the future emperor of Jahangir. In fact, this would be the feature of reign of all Mughal emperors. Every Mughal emperor was, distracted by the rebellion of his sons during the last phase of his year. Jahangir, the Sisodia ruler of Mewar, Amar Singh, the descendant of Rana Pratap, accepted Mughal service. Less successful campaigns against the Sikhs, Ahoms and Ahmednagar followed. Okay, by this time the conflict with the Sikhs had started. Ahoms of Assam, now since they had already captured Bengal, so they moved forward into the Brahmaputra valley, into Assam. Ahmednagar, Akbar had partly annexed, but he tried to do some more and mainly consolidate the hold on the parts that Akbar had conquered. Prince Khurram, the future Emperor Jahangir, rebelled in the last years of his reign. The efforts of Nur Jahan, Jahangir's wife, to marginalize him were unsuccessful. Basically, Nur Jahan wanted her own son-in-law to become Badshah, but Shah Jahan, aka Prince Khurram, aka Shah Jahan, revolted. Here, they have not mentioned in the book this person, Malik Ambar. But it's perhaps one of the most fascinating figures of India's history. There is this book, Incarnations, in which the author talks about the 15 personalities of India's history, and Malik Ambar features as one of them. He was originally from Abyssinia, the modern-day Ethiopia. He was an African. He was sold into slavery much earlier in his life. He came to India, and gradually he rose through the ranks, so much so that due to the attacks of Mughals, Akbar had partly annexed Ahmednagar and Jahangir pushed further. So the Ahmednagar Sultanate, which was descendant of Bahmani Sultanate, when the Bahmani Sultanate disintegrated, 5 sultanates came up: Ahmed, Bijapur, Golconda, Berar, Berar and Bidar. These 5 came up. Out of these, 3 were important. Ahmednagar, you know where modern Ahmednagar is, so you can imagine it would be around it. Golconda, roughly corresponding to modern day Telangana and some parts of Andhra. And then Bijapur, the southern Maharashtra and Karnataka area. So these 3 sultanates were important. Akbar pushed forward. Actually, here we had the map. See, the word Ahmednagar is here, Golconda, and they must have written Bijapur somewhere here. Here, Bijapur. These 3 sultanates. So he conquered some of it, Akbar, but not entirely. Jahangir only wanted to consolidate that part. But during this process, the Ahmednagar Sultanate collapsed. And the daring entrepreneurial people like Malik Ambar came forward. He was an official of Ahmednagar Sultanate. He propped up the Ahmednagar Sultanate once again, fought guerrilla warfare with Mughals, and he was the one that brought the guerrilla warfare into picture. And he militarily empowered the Maratha Sardars. His guerrilla armies consisted of Siddhis, the Africans, and the local Marathas, cavalry as well as, infantry. So he is the, the genesis of guerrilla warfare in India. Later on, when Maratha Empire or the Maratha Sardars fought directly with when their clash was directly with the Mughal emperors, their primary tactic was guerrilla warfare. and that guerrilla warfare, that technique was perfected by Malik Ambar. Shah Jahan, the Mughal campaign, during his time, Mughal campaigns in Deccan continued, though things like this are not that significant. Campaigns were launched against Ahmednagar, the Bundelas were, again, this is also not that important. In the northwest, the campaigns to seize bulk from Uzbeks was unsuccessful, and Kandahar was lost to Safavid. Akbar had won, Shah Jahan lost, and it was never recovered again. In 1632, Ahmednagar was finally annexed. So finally, Ahmednagar was fully annexed. Actually, what had happened, that they divided Ahmednagar. Aurangzeb, at this point, Aurangzeb was the Subedar or the governor of Deccan province. So what they decided, that Ahmednagar will be divided between Mughal Sultanate, Mughal Empire, sorry, not Sultanate, my mistake. Do not use the word Sultanate for Mughals, okay? Mughal Empire, because Sultanate has a very specific meaning. Sultanate belongs to a Sultan, and Sultan is the deputy of Caliph. Whereas Mughals had no such relationship with Caliph, okay? They had no pretension of being, second to Caliph or anyone. So it was my mistake. Don't associate the word Sultanate with Mughals, okay? So the arrangement was that Ahmednagar will be divided between Mughals as well as Bijapur and Golconda. However, the predominant area, largely the major part of the area went to Mughals. Finally annexed, and Bijapur sued for peace. And in this peace discussions, Bijapur was given some part of the land, which Aurangzeb did not like, and immediately within 20 years he said, no, give me the land that we gave you from Ahmednagar. Okay, and that was the rupture between Aurangzeb and the Deccan Sultanates. That after that, the meeting of hearts was never possible. No matter what Aurangzeb or Mughal emperor would say, they could trust them. Eventually, same again, even at the end of his reign, Aurangzeb versus Dara Shikoh, Shah Jahan was imprisoned for the rest of his life. Basically, Aurangzeb defeated Dara Shikoh in not one but two wars. In Samugarh, okay, and Dharmat. Two places he defeated him consequently. So he was, though curious thing is, every Mughal emperor became emperor when their father was dead. But that is not the case of Aurangzeb. He imprisoned his father, kept him in Agra. He himself ruled from Delhi, and he did not come to Agra till his father died. So there was a considerable period during which Shah Jahan was alive, but Aurangzeb had become an effective emperor. And when his father died, it is only then he conducted his proper, coronation ceremony. Now we are looking at some important developments of his phase. See, Ahoms were defeated in 1663. Now we had already seen here that even Jahangir had conducted some campaigns against Ahoms, but they were less successful because it is very difficult to control frontier areas. Okay, again they were defeated in 63 but rebelled in fact Ahoms were never decisively defeated. Okay, the Bengal was, you can safely say that the Bengal was the outermost province. Beyond that, any Mughal control was very, very short-lived. Campaigns against Yusufzai were a Pathan tribe of northwest of the current Khyber Pakhtunkhwa area. It is the Afghanistan Pathan border. Yusufzai, you must have heard the name Malala Yousafzai, that Peace Prize, Nobel Peace Prize winning girl from Pakistan. So this is the tribe. Campaigns against Yusufzai and Sikhs were, see, the conflict between Sikhs and Mughals deserves a separate attention, since it's a very complicated and very detailed, elaborate, proper issue. Therefore, they have not covered it in 7th class NCERT. Now, Mughal intervention in the succession and internal politics of Rathod Rajputs of Marwar led to their rebellion. Actually, when Aurangzeb died, immediately after the terminal decline of Mughal Empire began. So historians have often concentrated, put him under the lens. They have often concentrated on Aurangzeb and to find out the causes of the decline of Mughal Empire during his reign. And this event, his rupture with the Rajputs, although temporary, is considered one of the major faults. Okay, they say that since Aurangzeb intervened in the succession matter of a Rajput state, due to this, all the Rajput states became, disaffected. There were rebellion. The very close ally was lost. Such thing. However, that idea has been rejected for a couple of reasons. That though Rathor Rajputs of Marwar rebelled and they were supported by Sisodias of Mewar, but other Rajput states of Bundi, Kota, Jaisalmer, as other places, Bhatis, none of them rebelled. Only the Mewar and Marwar went against him, and that disturbance was quelled very soon. The alliance between Marwar and Mewar was broken when Marwar eventually came to the agreement with Mughals. So the importance of a faulty Rajput policy of Aurangzeb, see, you cannot question that whether it was a faulty policy or not. It was a faulty policy, but it was not the main cause of the decline of Mughal emperor. That is the point here. Campaigns against the Maratha chieftain Shivaji were initially successful, but Shivaji eventually declared himself an independent king. Here also a mistake was made. If you had seen the recently released movie Tanaji, they had talked about it that the Aurangzeb sent Mirza Raja Jai Singh to fight Shivaji, and he very successfully, encircled Shivaji. He won many forts, and eventually Shivaji had to come to, negotiate. And Mirza Raja Jai Singh made him an offer that, look, go to Agra, talk to emperor, maybe come to a settlement with him. But when Shivaji visited Agra, he was mistreated, he was imprisoned, he eventually fled, and from that point, same thing. The meeting of hearts between Shivaji and Mughals was not possible, and eventually he declared himself king of the areas under his control. Even here, the rise of Marathas as a political power is a very long, complicated process. In fact, the comparisons are made between the rise of Rajputs as a social group and the rise of Marathas. Such comparisons, for obvious reasons, cannot be given in a 7th or 10th class NCERT. That is a subject matter of very detailed discussions or detailed studies, especially in optionals, etc. So, Shivaji eventually declared himself an independent king. After Akbar's rebellion, all these things, his Rajput policy, his Maratha policy, in fact, whenever we study Mughal emperors properly, we make 3 heads. The Rajput policy, the religious policy, the Deccan policy, and other thing. And they compare what was Akbar's Rajput policy, what was Jahangir, Shah Jahan, Aurangzeb. Similarly, Deccan policy, Akbar, Jahangir, Shah Jahan, Aurangzeb. In each head, they compare the policies of different rulers, they give merits and demerits and the consequences that the next emperor had to deal with. However, since they had to simplify the book, so we are going in this manner. After Akbar's rebellion, this was the son of Aurangzeb, okay, he was given the name of Akbar. This is not the Jalaluddin Akbar of his great-grandfather. After Akbar's rebellion, Aurangzeb sent armies against the Deccan Sultanates. Bijapur was annexed in 1685 and Golconda. Actually, this is how they have written in the book. But what actually happened that Aurangzeb's Deccan policy is divided into 3 parts. In first part, he only tried to recover the entire Ahmednagar Sultanate, the part that he had conceded to Bijapur. He said, no, I want those parts, give it to me. Then by the time Maratha Sardars had become a problem for him, so he tried to convince Golconda and Bijapur to cooperate to quell the threat of Shivaji. But when that did not happen, he became sure that to deal with the Maratha problem, he must deal with the Deccan Sultanates. Then he launched a full-fledged campaigns against them, and Bijapur was annexed in 1685. And Golconda in 87. Akbar's rebellion was either a ruse or it was not that important. From 1698 onwards, Akbar campaigned personally in Deccan against the Marathas who started guerrilla warfare. He also had to face the rebellions of Sikh, Jat, Satnamis. See, these 3 are associated with the agrarian crisis during the 17th century. We will study it later. However, his personal campaign against the Marathas. See, ideally, when you have captured a new territory, the role of emperor should be over. Okay, he should have gone back to Agra and left the nitty-gritties of administration or administrative reorganization or dealing with small disturbances here and there to the generals on the field. But Aurangzeb being Aurangzeb, he wanted to do it himself, everything. Partly because he did not trust anyone, and partly because he definitely lacked the foresight of Akbar. So he stayed on the field till his death. Okay, he died in the field. Once he had left, he stayed in Deccan for almost 25 years, and he died in Deccan, near somewhere near Aurangabad. Okay, his mausoleum is certainly in that area. So even after annexing all the important kingdoms, even to counter guerrilla warfare, even so he went from fort to fort chasing the Maratha Sardars, rather unbecoming of an emperor. But that was his way of doing his business. And at his death, immediately a succession conflict emerged, and many people take the death of Aurangzeb as the beginning of modern period, not modernity, not progress. Beginning of modern period. That means beginning of the most recent period. Because immediately afterwards there was a civil war. Not new. Every Mughal emperor had faced the civil war. But what was unique this time, that there was a rapid succession of Mughal emperors after him. I mean, look how long he ruled. From 1658 to 1707, almost 50 years. Almost. But emperors after him, 1 year, 2 year, few months. And each time the Mughal nobles became more and more powerful. Some of them became kingmaker, some of them even became king killer. I mean, to kill a Mughal emperor and to live to tell the tale. It is such a fascinating thing. Therefore, the complete terminal decline started after Aurangzeb's death. Therefore, often historians try to look for causes for decline of Mughal emperor during his reign, and therefore this is precisely the reason why Akbar has been under the scrutiny lens for so long. Forget his all the policies. He may be a bigot, he may be not. Forget any other thing. After him, the decline was so sure that it is natural to point fingers at him and to look for reasons during his reign. Mughal traditions of succession. Now see, we saw that many, almost be Babur, be it not at times of Humayun, because when Humayun died the choice was rather easy. Akbar was the young 13-year-old. There was no one ready to take the throne. So apart from reign of Humayun, every Mughal emperor had to deal with this problem, the struggle between his sons. Why? Because the problem at the root of this is that there was no, the policy of succession was rather complicated, and this is not unique to Mughals. If you recall, at the time of Sultanate, we say that there was no proper theory of kingship. Anybody with ambitions and resources could aspire to become king, and indeed became king or sultan. Before that, even in ancient period, there is no guarantee that the son of the father will become king. If he is weak, vacillating, then someone more capable would replace him, and someone more capable should replace him. I mean, a state and empire is not personal property, that no matter how useless your son is, it should go to your son or your daughter. The king must be capable, and if the eldest son or the most obvious choice to be successor is not capable, then someone more capable must remove that person. And if that entails war and bloodshed, then be it so. That is nothing new. I mean, the circumstances of Ashoka's Ashok's coronation were also very violent. Okay, and that thing is covered in the Buddhist literature. So, violence to become king is nothing new. Mughals did not believe in the rule of primogeniture. Primogeniture means the property goes to the eldest son, and obviously state is not a property. Therefore, the rule of primogeniture is ridiculous. To say that having a rule of primogeniture would bring more stability to empire is naive. What if your eldest son is your most useless one? Okay, immediately the empire will fall apart. And when an empire falls apart, the day-to-day misery and chaos and civil wars, they are more worse than 1 or 2 wars to decide who should be the king. Instead, they followed the custom of coparcenary inheritance, meaning the inheritance should be divided between sons. This was a Mughal tradition. Okay, in fact, even Afghans had this tradition, that the property of father will be divided among son. So what happened, that at the death of Babur, all 4 of his sons made claim that okay, give me my share of my father's dominion, give me my share, give me my share. But Babur, who had chosen Humayun to be his successor, had given him, when he was dying, he had said that look, don't divide your empire, but please be kind to your brothers, because he knew that his brothers will make a, they will make a go at him, that they will try their best to snatch their part of the dominion. And Humayun, to his credit, did his best to be nice to his brothers. It is only when they left him no choice that he took some harsh measures. So each Mughal emperor had to face rebellion. Akbar by Jahangir, Jahangir by Shah Jahan, and the height was by Aurangzeb. He became emperor when the emperor was alive. Okay, he kept him incarcerated. Now see, imagine the decline in the authority of Badshah, that the Badshah is alive, yet the court and the nobles and army is following the commands of another Badshah. Kingship never went to anyone outside. However, the uniqueness about it is that the kingship never went to anyone outside the Timurid family, unlike Delhi Sultanate where dynasties kept changing. I mean, starting with Babur in 1526 till the point when British said that's it, no more Mughal emperors, the throne always remained within the Timurid dynasty. Okay? Never it went to some other dynasty. There was no, Khalji dynasty after slave dynasty. There was no Tughlaq dynasty after Khalji dynasty, then Sayyids and Lodhis. No, they were always Timurid. From A to Z, always Timurid. So, though gradually nobles became powerful, they became kingmaker, they became king killer, but never they could imagine to become a Badshah. And that is the reason. That is the reason why in 1857 the memory of Mughal emperors, the Timurid emperors, was still so powerful that there was a natural choice for the rebelling soldiers. Now, which do you think is a fairer division of inheritance? This question was raised in the book. Primogeniture or coparcenary? I mean, should the eldest son become the king, or it should be divided between the children? Obviously, dividing is a very bad idea. This is not property. Okay? If you divide it, again you have to create an empire, or so much war, so much bloodshed. Or giving it to the eldest son, it might sound good that yeah, there would be no wars, the law is clear, eldest son becomes the king, no problem. But what if the eldest son is incompetent? Now, in modern day democracies and societies, institutions govern everything. There is separation of power, there is judiciary, and even if within executive or anywhere, there is proper hierarchy, there is proper order, roles and responsibilities are defined. But in kingships, when all the power, all the authority flows from the king, who has so much discretion, that being sagacious, being ambitious, being bold, ruthless when the time requires, having all the attributes of a proper king is very important. So, just because someone is the eldest son, that doesn't mean he is the most capable. So, I don't know the answer to this question, but I don't think either primogeniture or coparcenary is the correct one. And often historians say that fine, it's okay to have one or two battles at the time of a new king's arrival. After all, when though Aurangzeb fought few battles, first he fought few battles with Dara Shikoh, and then he betrayed his own other brothers with whom he had aligned. But eventually then there was a 50-year-long peace. Then he said, no, there are no more fights for the throne of Mughal emperor. So I think the answer would be neither. And in social science, you can give your argument. There is no perfect answer. Then Mughal relations with other rulers. Okay. It was Akbar who came up with a carrot and stick policy vis-a-vis Rajputs. What was the carrot? Marriage alliances. If you make an alliance, you will be given high positions in the Mansabdari system. Now, what is Mansabdari? We will see soon. To briefly say right now, it was the system of administration in Mughal period. Okay. Also, the Jagirs or the states of the particular Rajput family, they will keep that state. Okay, it will be nominally incorporated into the administrative structure, that if you have a small state, then it will be called a district of a particular state, and if it's a large state, then it will be called a state itself. But the internal autonomy will remain complete. There will be no interference. Occasionally, if there is confusion about the inheritance, say two sons are claiming the throne of their dead father, then Mughal emperor may intervene on behalf of one or the other for the sake of stability, something which Akbar had also done in the case of Marwar, because the interference of Mughal emperor in the inheritance struggle of Rajput states was not new. This time Akbar Aurangzeb rather messed it up. He showed some immature signs. So they could keep their own state as Watan Jagirs, and if they were sent on a mission somewhere else, then they were given additional salaries. So this was the carrot part. And what was the stick? If you don't submit, then your state will be seized. The way they fought Mewar, okay? They said ki no, if you do not submit to our authority, you will have to fight us. And the Mughal military machine was the formidable one for the time. The mother of Jahangir was a Kachwaha princess, and the mother of Shah Jahan was a Rathod princess from Marwar. So such was the importance of the marital alliance. Also, there is the difference between the marital alliances conceived by Akbar and previous times was that this time it was done on equal terms. It was never forced that yes, if you don't want to marry your daughter to our sons and princes, that's fine. It's your choice. It's voluntary. Also, once they were married, they were not converted. They could practice their religion freely. I mean, in the architecture of Fatehpur Sikri, you clearly see that the princes were allowed to express their regional identity in that architecture. Okay. Also, they could easily maintain relationship with their family. Akbar himself had very good relationship with his in-laws. Mansinghs and such, they were given very important positions in the Mughal administrative system. So the matrimonial alliances were not conducted as not treating the people as inferior, but as equal, as members of the ruling family. So this was the carrot and stick policy. Again, what about the other ones? However, the careful balance between defeating but not humiliating opponents was not maintained all the time. For example, the way Aurangzeb treated Shivaji. Aurangzeb said that he is a bhuiya, a petty bhuiya, means a landlord. He is a petty landlord. He is not worth my respect. So the balance between respecting, in fact, what often they used to do, that once Mughals or Mughal commanders had defeated a local king, they would say, look, we have defeated you. However, we know that you have a stronghold here. So to completely annex your state is not viable, and it is not sagacious as well. So we will incorporate you as a Mansabdar in the Mughal system. The state you had will be called your Watan Jagir. See, tell your people that you are still their king, but for us, we are paying you, we are giving it to you as a salary. So a kind of mutually beneficial arrangement. And if we ask you, and if you agree to serve the empire somewhere else, then you will be given additional salaries. So incorporating a state into the Mansabdari system, okay, was a part of expanding Mughal empire. It was not a homogeneous structure that, okay, whenever it went, it demolished the local state, it demolished the local customs, it demolished the local governance manners. No, if a particular state or a particular area had a strong sense of regional autonomy, then their autonomy was respected. Only that was called a Watan Jagir. Okay. And they were incorporated into the larger administration. Others like Safavids and Uzbeks. In the case of Safavids, we see there was some, for example, Humayun fled to Safavid court of Iran. He came back with the help of Safavids. He even brought painters from Iran. But Akbar realized the importance of Kandahar that Safavids has ceased from, so he took it from them. But there were many struggles for Kandahar, and eventually it was ruled, taken away by Safavids during the time of Shah Jahan. And the relationship with Uzbeks of Central Asia, it was always bitter. The Mughal emperors never trusted them. In fact, there was this offer by a Uzbek king to Akbar that, look, you are a Sunni Muslim, I am a Sunni Muslim, Ottomans are also Sunni Muslim, then why don't we divide the Shia power sitting between us? Aurangzeb understood the importance of, Akbar understood the importance of balance of power. He politely declined. He said that, no, don't worry about this Shia Sunni thing. Okay, if you want a passage to go to Hajj pilgrimage, then we are giving you a passage via Gujarat. Don't bother with this Ya Sunni thing. It's not worthy of our time. Forget it. Also, there were on other occasions when Uzbeks threatened his empire, Akbar shifted his capital from Agra to Lahore and stayed at Attock, which is at the foothills of Indus comes at the ground level. There the place is Attock is there, and he stayed there for a very long time. And he stayed there until the Uzbek threat was removed. He realized that no, now Uzbeks cannot attack. Only then he went back. So he stayed in Lahore area, Lahore Attock area for a very long time, just to preempt any future Uzbek attack on Mughal empire. So this was the two components. And then the Deccan policy. Actually the Deccan policy of Mughal emperors is studied as a separate heading. The first, what was Akbar's policy, then Jahangir, Shah Jahan, Aurangzeb, how in each phase changes took place, how each successive emperor had to deal with the policy of previous one. For example, Akbar only wanted to establish his sovereignty over them. They should accept his overlordship. Then Jahangir just wanted to secure the gains the Akbars had made. Shah Jahan was kind of vacillating. At times he wanted to annex, at times he didn't want to annex. And Aurangzeb's policy has few phases, though the details of which we should study at the time of optional. Mughal administrative framework. Okay. At the center, Badshah was the fountainhead of all authority and all power. Mughal Badshah. Or somewhere they write Padshah as well, B or P. Okay. Then there were 4 important ministers and their departments: Diwan, Mir Bakshi, Chief Sadr, and Mir Saman. Though this is not given in the book, we have just given for convenience. You can think of it in terms of finance ministry. Okay, just to simplify things, you can think in terms of finance ministry. But there wasn't one finance minister. There were often 2-3. And since it was a very key position, they made a very important checks and balance. We will cover it later now. Then you can look at it as a defense ministry. Again, I'm simplifying a lot here. Okay. However, since this goes outside the scope of the book, I'm using this approach. Then the religious department, religion, charity, etc. Religion, charity. And then we have stores, Mughal harem, looking after Mughal harem, etc. This is indeed an oversimplification, but as they have not covered it in the book, so we are giving it a very cursory look. Then in provinces, they had Subedar, who looked after general administration, law and order; Diwan, who looked after the finances, revenue collection, etc. Bakshi, military affairs; and Sadr. Okay. The key point was that at the center, Diwans were accountable to Badshah. But at the province, Diwan was not accountable to Subedar. He was accountable to the central Diwan. Okay. The argument was simple: to prevent any particular Subedar from, acquiring too much power or too much stronghold over the province. So Diwan was responsible to central Diwan, Bakshi to central Bakshi, and Subedar was responsible to Badshah. Below province level were Sarkar, same thing, law and order and general administration. Finances, okay, collecting land revenue, maintaining records, and this was you can talk it about a commissioner of police kind of way, the chief policeman of any city, Kotwal of a fort, etc. And at the Pargana level, you had this person for general administration, law and order, for collecting land revenue and maintaining records of land transaction, land ownership, etc. However, they put some checks and balances in Mughal administration, such as often there were 2-3 Diwans. Okay, Todarmal was the most famous during Akbar's time, but they may ensured that there were 2-3 Diwans, and they often came from very humble background. Their rank in the Mughal administrative system was, their rank was very low. Say about you make a person with a joint, a director's rank, you make him a minister. Why? Because so that he has a low salary, low position in ranking, so he would remain humble and do not try to acquire too much power. Okay. Also, with main defense minister, you had 2 subsidiary defense minister to help him in his work, and obviously to balance him. The other checks and balances, we said that the Diwan was not responsible to Subedar, but to the central Diwan. Similarly, Amal Guzar was responsible to provincial Diwan, not to the Faujdar. So that there was this separation between general, though crudely, there was a separation between Home Ministry and Finance Ministry. And they were both separately responsible to the Home Ministry and Finance Ministry at higher level. Then there were some problems in administration called Jagirdari crisis, agrarian crisis, and its link with provincial Mughal administration. Though first we will try to understand what was the Jagirdari crisis and agrarian crisis. See, first, administrative system, the key feature. We had talked about Iqta system for Sultanate administration. Therefore, we have here Mansabdari system. Okay. Akbar understood that he needed a composite ruling class to govern a diverse country like India. So he carried forward the legacy of expanding the social base of ruling class. Expanding the social base of ruling class, what does it mean? So if you recall from last lecture that Iltutmish, the first Delhi Sultan, he depended mainly on the slaves, the loyal slaves, to govern and to man the key positions of his administration. Then Balban adopted an exclusive racial policy that he will only appoint Turks. He only trusted Turks. But then as the empire expanded and consolidated, the future sultans realized that, look, we have to incorporate local elements, we have to incorporate local aristocracy, rural aristocracy, Hindus and local Muslims, etc. So gradually, the social base of empire had to be expanded. Can you run government of India by hiring IAS and IPS officers from one or two state only, or one or two caste only, or one or two religion only? That is not advisable. That is not possible. There will be so many frictions. Similarly, if you want to run an empire that controls villages as well as cities, if you want to run an empire that not only is limited to one or two provinces but is expanded to the entire India, then you need a composite bureaucracy, a composite administration. You need to expand the social base of your administration, incorporate people of different ethnicities and identities. So Akbar understood it and continued with it. And in that order, he first incorporated Rajputs and then many other local landed aristocracy. Okay, the key word is landed aristocracy. Okay. From a small nucleus of Turani nobles, Mughal nobility expanded to include Iranians. Turani means Central Asian. Though there are other varieties as well, but just take it as Central Asian. Iranians, Indian Muslims, Rajputs, Marathas, Afghans and other groups. Those who joined Mughal service were enrolled as Mansabdar. Okay. So this was in a way your group. That group A officer, group B officer, group C officer, group D officer. This does not decide that which ministry you will serve, in which state you will serve, what will be your responsibility. But this was your grading, that you are group A, group B, etc. But there were many groups actually. It was a grading system to fix rank, salary and military responsibility. Actually, it was a twist grading system. You had two ranks, Zat rank and Sawar rank. Your Sawar rank will never be higher than Zat rank. It will be either equal to or less than Zat rank. The Zat rank decided your rank. Like, are you group A officer, group B officer? In group A, are you A1, A2, A3? In group B, are you B1, B2, B3? Such way. As well as your salary. What is your salary? Just for being a member of Mansabdari system. Okay, and Sawar rank decided your military responsibility. Okay, it decided your military responsibility, meaning how much soldiers, how much horses, cavalry, how much horse, cavalry, how much infantry, how much elephant you are supposed to maintain. Okay, so your Jat rank decided your salary and rank, and Sawar rank decided your military responsibility. And for both these, you will be paid. You will be paid your salary. Now, if your rank is very low, okay, you are in, a very low rank, then you will be paid in cash. But if your rank is very high, paying you in cash regularly is a, difficult thing. So you will be given a jagir. Now, as you say, as you said right now, not all mansabdars were given jagir. Only mansabdars of a rank higher than a certain level were given jagirs. So this is the difference between jagirdari system and mansabdari system. Often those two names are taken interchangeably, and rightly so. But there is this one tiny difference, that smaller mansabdars were not given jagir. You are a member of Mughal administrative system, group A, B, C, D, but you are not being given jagir. You will be given cash salary wherever you are employed in the empire. Now, one comparison, rather one or two comparisons with the Iqta system, that enrolling in Mansab, one is that in Iqta system, the Iqtadar was posted in the same province. Okay, that okay, this we are giving you this Iqta, go serve in that province. That is your province, and that is why they were so centrifugal. They were such a destabilizing force that the moment they become powerful, they want to separate. But here, a mansabdar might have his jagir in Bengal province, but he might be serving in Ajmer province. He might have his jagir in say Gujarat province, but he might be serving in say Kabul province. Man Singh was once made governor of Bengal, okay, whereas his Watan jagir was in Rajasthan area. So this is one feature. The regular administration will be run by Mughal bureaucracy. So, for example, imagine the Subedar of a province. Okay? The Subedar of, say, Lahore might have his jagir in Malwa. Okay? So, here you are running the administration, but your salary comes from Malwa. There, the Diwan, the provincial Diwan, the provincial Amal Guzar, the provincial Amir, they will collect the land revenue, hand it over to your, agent there. Okay, your agent goes there with his own military contingent, takes help of local administration, collects the revenue and sends it back to you. Okay, now that agent could be related to you, he could be hired by you. What arrangement you have with the agent, that depends on person to person, but this is one major difference. Okay. Enrolling in Mansabdari system was a sign of accepting Mughal suzerainty, that we said that once a king or Raja was defeated, they said fine, we are not, if they found it politically expedient that it is better to incorporate that person rather than extinguish his house, they will say okay, become member of Mansabdari system, here is your Jat rank, here is your Sawar rank, and since your income from your own state is same, so we don't pay you anything extra. It's a very, very convenient thing that we are not going to give you any salary because we are letting you to keep your state. This is your Watan Jagir. However, we see that this is your income. So accordingly, we are giving you this Jat and Sawar rank. So notionally, you are a member of Mughal Mansabdari system. If they give him paraphernalia of being Mughal Mansabdari, a belt, a turban or coat, something like that, a dagger as a symbols. In Akbar's reign, there were 29 Mansabdars with a rank of 5,000 Jat rank. It's a very high rank. Okay, 5,000 and above were given to very high officials. 7,000 will be given to princes, etc. So, see, even princes were incorporated into it. It doesn't matter whether you are serving in civil capacity or in military capacity, or you are doing nothing, just sitting in the court. Being a member of Mughal nobility meant being a member of Mansabdari system. Okay. So at Akbar's time, there were 29 with a rank of 5,000. By Aurangzeb's reign, this number had gone up to 79. Such high number. So would this have meant more expenditure for the state? The question is, if the high-ranking Mansabdars has gone up from 29 to 79, would it mean, is it good for the state or bad for the state? Okay. Now, can you have that much jagir to give around? There's this famous Hindi saying, "Ek anar swa bimar," and this indeed became a problem by the end of Aurangzeb's reign. Okay, that there were too many mansabdars, but there were too few good quality jagirs. We shall look into it problem soon. See, before it, let's see what had happened. That, look, if you have too many mansabdars, that you need more and more jagirs. Okay. But what happened during Aurangzeb's reign, and which is often called the Mansabdari crisis or Jagirdari crisis. The Jagirdari crisis is that you don't have enough Jagirs to give to Mansabdars. That on one hand, too many Mansabdars. Too many Mansabdars. Okay? Though Aurangzeb annexed new areas like Golconda and Bijapur, even the officials of that state were added to Mansabdari system. So this problem enhanced. And whatever new land he got, the fertile ones, productive ones were added to the Khalisa land. If you recall, the word Khalisa means the income from that land goes straight to the royal treasury. Why? Because he had to fight so many wars. So the land that is productive, that is giving you, tax properly, you are keeping it for yourself and giving unproductive land to distribute to new zamindars. So the ones they get, they find it very difficult to extract revenue from it. And then by the time of Aurangzeb, due to the very high taxation rate, what had happened that Akbar started with 1/3 taxation, land revenue rate, but very high taxation up to Aurangzeb's period, as much as 50%. Due to this, there were many agrarian revolts. Okay, what we said, that Jat revolt, the Sikh revolt, Satnami revolt, the revolts in northwest, the revolts, and the agrarian revolts were problem since the time of Akbar, but it became very, very acute by the time of Aurangzeb. So due to high taxation, they revolted a lot. So A, now you have too many mansabdars. B, the fertile land you acquire, you are keeping it to yourself and you are giving less productive land. On the other hand, taxation rate is very high. So whatever land the mansabdars are getting, they find it very difficult to extract revenue from that land. Because A, often they are not productive. B, due to already very high taxation rate, the peasants are revolting and the mansabdars are not able to collect land revenue from there. So two terms emerged, Zore-Talab and Sere-Hasil, means the places where it is, you have to do Jor Zabardasti, you have to force. To get what you demand, you have to use force. But on the other hand, Sere-Hasil means you just go there and collect revenue easily. So there were a large number of Zore-Talab Jagirs and very small number of Sere-Hasil Jagirs. So there was this competition among Mansabdars to get the good Jagirs, to corner more and more Jagirs for themselves and their friends. Due to this, factionalism in the Mughal court emerged. And this factionalism became very problematic, especially after Aurangzeb died, because weak successors could not balance or, control the opposing factions with each other. And therefore, we see that nobility became more and more factional, more and more conspiracy ridden, more and more jealous of each other, so much so that they started using emperor as a pawn in their fight. So, although I have skipped many important points and given a very, very brief overview, but this is in broad the Jagirdari crisis. Then another thing, Japti system. The main source of income was land revenue. Todermal carried out a careful survey of crop yields, prices. Todermal was the Diwan, one of the many Diwans. In fact, see the genius of Akbar. Todermal was originally originally he was a finance minister of Sur emperors. He was finance minister of Sher Shah Suri. But being a man of talent, Akbar retained him. He said, no, we need this person. Okay, forget who else he was serving. We need this person. So he carried out a careful survey of crop yield, prices, area cultivated for a 10-year period, that is 560 to 580. On the basis of this data, tax was fixed on each crop in cash. Each province was divided into revenue circles with its own schedule of revenue rates called Dastur, and then the land was classified. See what happened here. we remember the first attempt at land revenue reforms were made by Alauddin Khilji. However, he made a mistake. The mistake was that he imposed a uniform 50% rate on all land. The land was not classified. Okay. Now, how do you assess 50%? Randomly from any land you assess that, okay, this much is the crop yield, so 50% of it. But what if it was a good quality land? So 50% of the crop of a good quality land is perhaps 75 or 80% of an average quality land and 100% of a bad quality land. So without classifying the land, fixing a uniform rate of taxation is very arbitrary. And possibly this was the reason why immediately after his death, his reforms were abandoned. Then Sher Shah understood it and he classified it into three categories: good, bad and middling. Okay. And on the basis of that, he fixed land revenue for each category of land. But here what he did, while converting, say you are charging 50%, 25% of crop. Okay. Now you are converting it into money. What would be the rate? At what rate you are going to convert that 25% of crop into the money that the farmer owes to you? So he used the rates prevailing in cities, especially near the capital. Now the rates near cities will be very high compared to the rates in countryside. So the 25% effectively became much more. Okay, you said that look, your land, this is a medium quality land. On this land you are growing 100 kgs of wheat. Now we want 25%. That means 25 kg. However, we are not asking in kind, we are asking in cash. So let's multiply that, since 1 kg of wheat is 30 rupee. So you give us 450 rupees. Okay. No, 450. You want 25 kgs. Okay, pardon my mathematics. Then we said 30 rupees, so 750, right? 250, 450. Okay, you give us 750 rupees. But farmer says, how are you saying 30 rupees? I just sold wheat at 10 rupees per kg. He says, no, 30 rupees is near the cities. So that is a random thing. So at the time of Akbar, even this problem was dealt with. In fact, Akbar went further in classifying the land. He said, no, don't simply classify. First, he made classification even clear. He classified the land into 4 categories: Polaj, Paroti, Chachar and Banjar. Okay, that means a land which is cultivated every year, a land which is which is left fallow for 1 year, a land which is left fallow for a few years, 3-4 years, and a land which was though it was cultivable, but it was wasteland. That means currently it is not being cultivated, but it can be reclaimed for the purpose of agriculture. The rates for all 4 of categories of the land were different. Okay, say a Banjar land will have to pay full rates only in the 5th year. A Chachar land will have to pay the full rate in 3rd year. So even he took the classification even further, and while deciding the rates at which the crop will be converted into cash, there they divided their empire into revenue circles. For each circles, they saw that here what is the crop yield, what has been the price level in past 10 years, and how much area is cultivated. So using all this data, they divided the empire into revenue circles, and for each circle they created revenue rates for individual crops. That if you are growing wheat, on what quality of land, what is the local price level. Okay, then it is, if it is a Polaj, Paroti, Chachar, Banjar, then depending upon which year is it and how much you have to pay. So this was the very detailed revenue rate, and it was called Dastur. See, today Dastur means this is the Dastur, this is the norm, but the Dastur comes from this word. Again, that idea that the meaning of the word keeps changing. So this was the norm for paying revenue rates. Okay, land was classified into various categories, and to measure the land they used this unit called Gaje Ilahi. Okay, This system was called the Japti system. It was prevalent in those areas where Mughal administration could survey the land and keep detailed records. It was not possible in provinces such as Gujarat and Bengal, which were far away from the Mughal center, and they already had local norms of paying land revenue rates, so they did not want to disturb local conditions. Okay, so that means even the Japti system was not famous, not used across the empire. There were other systems called Nasak, Kankut, Batai systems. They depended on some other techniques, but Japti was a Mughal innovation. So they improvised. So Sher Shah Suri improvised upon Khilji, and Akbar improvised upon Sher Shah Suri. Now, agrarian crisis. In most places, peasants paid taxes through the rural elites, that is the headman or local chieftain. The Mughals used one term, Jamindars, to describe all the intermediaries. Okay, actually, in some areas, the Jamindars exercised a great deal of power. There were two types: primary Zamindars that directly owned the land, they were owner proprietor, and then intermediary Zamindars. That is, they were not involved in the cultivation, but they collected revenue as a hereditary right, and they then deposited money to the Mughal administration. The exploitation by Mughal administrators could drive them to rebellion. Sometimes Zamindars and peasants of the same caste are allied in rebelling against Mughal authority. Frequent transfers was a problem. See what we talked about, Zore Talab and Sare Hasil. That due to the very high rates, as high as 50%, and though it might sound surprising, but in some places like Gujarat, they were much higher than 50%, say 75%, 80%. So basically, Jagirs got divided into two. Zore Talab, that means you have to use a lot of force to collect land revenue, and Sare Hasil, where it was very easy. Obviously, all the nobles and mansabdars will want more and more Sare Hasil. So when there is a Ek Anar So Bimar situation, there will be factionalism at the court, and this is what Satish Chandra calls that the Jagirdari crisis was not only an economic problem but a sociological problem as well, because due to it, the Mughal mansabdars divided along racial lines. There was a Turani group, there was an Irani group, there was a group of Indian Muslims. Such groups were there in the. So also, many of the people say, in fact, especially the European visitors who came to India, Francois Bernier and such, they said that since Mughal Jagirdars were transferred so frequently, that okay, you are being given a Jagir at a particular place, but it will be taken back from you in 2-3 years. So he says that, does that Jagirdar have any incentive to improve agriculture? Why should he invest in agriculture? Why should he, undertake, productivity enhancement? Because he knows that today if I invest today, that Jagir will be taken away from me. So there is no incentive to invest, to improve productivity. What they do, they will use as much force as possible to extract as much revenue as possible, sometimes more than the stipulated amount. And especially because the corruption was very common in Mughal administration, so the nexus between the official and mansabdar was a problem. Okay. These peasant revolts were very common, but from the end of 17th century, these threatened the very foundation of Mughal Empire, and by the time of Aurangzeb, they had become a very big problem. Here we had talked about Jagirdari crisis, agrarian crisis, and provincial administration of Mughal Empire. So these things have a relationship with the provincial administration of Mughal Empire. This point, how they are related to provincial administration, we will see sooner. Now we are mentioning a very important source to study the Mughal history. Possibly the most important source, Ain-e-Akbari, written by Abul Fazl, a close friend and courtier of Akbar. It is a 3-volume account. The first deals with Akbar's ancestors, the second with the important events of Akbar's reign, and the third, it's a kind of gazette. Okay, it has come encyclopedia. It has so much. It deals with Akbar's administration, household, army, revenues, the geographies of empire. In fact, it carries a Pargana-wise list of Zamindars, and quite surprisingly, it mentions their caste as well. Okay, it provides rich details about the traditions and cultures of living people in India. people living in India. The most interesting aspects about Ain-e-Akbari is its rich statistical details. See, it gives you statistical details about what things such as crops, yields, prices, wages, revenues. Therefore, I mean, there is this notion that the practice of keeping record keeping, data keeping as a crucial part or core of governance came with the colonial government. No, this is not true. I mean, Ain-e-Akbari is a living, breathing example that the to rule a place, you have to know the place. You have to know its people. You have to know its empire. Know its resources. You have to know its capacity, its wealth, and to all that you have to count them. We often believe that these habits became associated with governance in India in modern time only. But Ain-e-Akbari is a good example that no, the understanding of counting anything and everything associated with the empire or the state is older than the colonial period. Ain-e-Akbari gives you a statistical detail. In fact, Ain-e-Akbari is where Abul Fazl explains the Sulh-e-Kul or the universal peace religious policy of Akbar. What happened that Akbar was a very inquisitive person, so he really wanted to understand the true nature of religion, etc. So what he did in his famous Ibadat Khana in Fatehpur Sikri, he started debates and discussions among the scholars. But he knew first he started with ulemas only, but then he made it an open competition. He said, fine, all the religions should come. Hindus should come, Jains should come, even Jews, Christians, that were very, very minority religion. He sent, correspondence to Portuguese colonies to send them Jesuit priests. And the priests that came, they were very happy. They thought, okay, if we are somehow able to convert emperor, then we will automatically convert his entire empire. And the priests that visited his court, Montserrat and Aquaviva, they have left accounts of their, stay at his court, and that also serves as a source of history to study the Mughal period. But eventually he got fed up with the dogmatic beliefs of religious scholars, not only Muslim but all sorts of scholars. He realized that okay, everyone thinks that they are great, their religion is great, their God is great. So he says either some elements of all the religions are true or none of them are true. So he realized that it's futile. It's futile to look for a core truth, because maybe even the scholars don't know. So, but he's a king. He's not a religious scholar. So he says ki which sort of religious policy should I use for my governance? How should I govern my society, especially the religious aspect? For that he came up with the idea of Sulh-e-Kul, universal peace, a social policy that inspired governance policy. Abul Fazl has explained it in Ain-e-Akbari. See, before him, Delhi Sultans, at least theoretically, claimed that their goal is to convert India from Darul Harb to Darul Islam. Okay? But Akbar made no such distinction. He said, forget these things. We are going for Sulh-e-Kul. He compared different components of society, the warrior class, the intellectual class, the trading class, and the commoners with different elements of nature. He said that the warrior class is fire, the trader class is the trader class is wind, the intellectual class is water, and the commoners are the land. And it is only with a symbiotic and mutually beneficial relationship with different elements of society the world can run peacefully. So he said, do not bother about religion, do not bother about sect, do not bother about ultimate truth. Maybe nobody knows what is the ultimate truth. Live peacefully, respect each other, tolerate each other's different views. And in this pursuit of tolerance, Akbar comes very close to Ashok. So in Ain-e-Akbari, Abul Fazl has explained what Akbar meant by Sulh-e-Kul, and even his son Jahangir and Shah Jahan, they accepted that yes, our father and grandfather's policy of Sulh-e-Kul was correct and we should follow it. Okay, Akbar commission the thing we talked about, translation. He says that Akbar commissioned the translation of many Sanskrit works into Persian. A Maktab Khana or translation bureau was set up. Mahabharat, Ramayana, Lilavati, Yoga Vashisht were translated The Razmanama. Look, they could create a question in prelims that Razmanama is a Persian translation of what? Oh, it's a, the name simply means the book of war. The translation of Mahabharata contains lavish illustrations of the events of Mahabharata. And here we talk about the illustrated manuscripts in later chapters. There was a question in this year's mains that evaluate the aim and impact of translation of Sanskrit scriptures into Persian language during Mughal period. In fact, it was not unique to Mughal period. A Tughlaq ruler called Firoz Shah Tughlaq also translated many Sanskrit works, especially on music, into Persian. So the question says, evaluate the aim and impact. Not only Akbar, even Dara Shikoh, the department still stayed around and it kept its work going on. But Dara Shikoh, the Mughal prince, the enemy of Aurangzeb, that they fought each other for the Mughal Takht, he was a very keen scholar of Upanishads. And he thought that there was, the message, the core message of Upanishad and the core message of the core Islamic message, they correspond with each other. He saw harmony in the message of Upanishad and Islamic traditions. So even he undertook translations. And in fact, through the Persian translations of Sanskrit works, the Europe and the West came to read many of the ancient scriptures of India. So this says, what was the aim and impact? The impact is obviously the old Sanskrit works found a much larger audience, and perhaps one aim was creation of a composite culture, understanding the true nature of the society that they were ruling, that they want to know that what is the that what are the ancient traditions of this land. And there are some historians who believe that they wanted to create a new idea of kingship, and in that end they looked for inspirations and institutions in ancient literature. So there was this question. Then decline of Mughal Empire. Okay. Death of Aurangzeb triggered a chain reaction which had an unmistakable mark of a terminal decline of Mughal Empire. I mean, the events after Aurangzeb's death are so unfortunate that when you read it in modern India, you say, okay, it's beyond doubt that the empire is declining. Many causes given for the decline of Mughal Empire. Look, first, people tended to blame, historians tended to blame individuals and their policies. For example, some said that Aurangzeb's religious and Rajput policy and Deccan policy were so fundamentally flawed that he is the only problem. Then people realized one person should not be held responsible. There must be structural problems. So they came up with the ideas of Jagirdari crisis and agrarian crisis. The Jagirdari crisis that we just talked about, that ek anar sau bimar. There were too many Jagirdars or Mansabdars chasing too few quality Jagirs. See, the word quality is important. The land was always there. Aurangzeb conquered a lot of new area, but he only allotted the land which was unfertile or less productive. Okay, so there were too many Mansabdars chasing too few good quality Jagirs. Agrarian crisis, frequent revolts made it worse. So the Jagirs were already divided into Sair-e-Hasil and Jor-e-Talab. So if too many people chase too few resources, in fact, some of the Mansabdars had to wait for a very long time before. It's like you are recruited. Okay, you are being sent on a posting, but you do not know when your first salary will come. And meanwhile, how are you supposed to maintain your lifestyle? How are you supposed to maintain your level of forces? I mean, there's this one contemporary record keeper of Aurangzeb's time. His name was Bhim Sen or something. He says that if we start calculating there would not be even 10% of total Mansabdar that keep actual stipulated strength. He says that all of them, since their income level has declined, they are maintaining a much lower level of army or armed forces than they are supposed to. So you are recruited, you are even posted, you are doing your job, but you don't know when you will get your salary. And once a Jagir is taken away from you, you have no idea when you will be allotted the next one. So such insecurity, it saps your inspiration, your willingness to serve the emperor. So cabals were created, factions were created in Mughal court, and this factionalism, especially after the death of Aurangzeb, became very frequent. Kingmakers appeared, king killers appeared, and there was erosion of legitimacy. So agrarian crisis and Mansabdari crisis are related to each other. However, they had a unique impact on the Mughal administration. We see it here. that the administrative and military efficiency of Mughal Empire led to the commercial prosperity. This commercial prosperity was not across the empire. It was in some parts like Bengal, okay, some parts like the Coromandel coast, some parts like the fertile areas of Muradabad, Awadh, Bareilly. So it was not a pan-empire phenomena, but certainly, especially due to the role of European trading companies. I think I have mentioned it here. Okay, foreign travelers. Okay, it is kept here. Okay, we will look into it here. Foreign travelers described it as the fabled land of wealth, but these same visitors were also appalled at the state of poverty that existed inside, side by side with the greatest opulence. The inequality was glaring. Actually, it's a person called Francois Bernier. He was a Frenchman who visited India. He said, look, India is indeed a land of wealth, but side by side there is extreme poverty. There is extreme inequality. Francois Bernier. Documents from the 12th century, 20th century of Shah Jahan's reign inform us that the highest ranking Mansabdars were only 445 out of a total 8,000. That means a mere 5.6% of Mansabdars received 61% of the total estimated revenue of empire. See, such gross inequality. I mean, what is left for the lower level officials? How would they be motivated to fight for the sake of empire? The poorest could hardly invest in additional resources. They had none. So there would be no increase in productivity. And unsurprisingly, there was no technological breakthrough like Persian wheel during this period, right? That automatically lifts productivity. The wealthier peasantry and artisanal groups, merchants and bankers profited in the economic world. After all, whatever increase in prosperity came, it did not trickle down. Only the wealthy, the artisans that were associated with Mughal courts, provincial courts, they benefited. But what about the ones living in villages? They did not benefit. So some sections of society benefited, but largely they did not. The Jagirdari crisis, agrarian crisis, no significant increase in productivity, weakened center, especially after Aurangzeb. Commercial property in some prosperity in some provinces, not all. They all acted in tandem. And how this commercial prosperity came in some provinces? The commercial revolution led by the European companies created wealth in 17th century. See, this was the time, by the time of which, the European companies, East India Company, Dutch East India Company, French East India Company, they had arrived and they had caused a commercial revolution. Meaning that they had created a vast new market for Indian goods, not only in Europe, but in Southeast Asia, in Africa, in New World as well. So they had created those provinces, especially the coastal provinces and the provinces whose goods were useful for trade, they experienced prosperity. And now this is the tricky part. What happens is that created wealth in some pockets, which made the regional elite extremely powerful in late 18th century. As the authority of the emperor slowly declined, they constituted new dynasties in Bengal, Awadh, Hyderabad. Although they continued to recognize Mughal emperor, by the 18th century the provinces of the empire had consolidated their independent political identities. So what happened? That wealth was created, but the regional elites, they prevented the wealth from reaching to center. If you recall, Mughal emperors used to do one important thing to control the provincial officials. The provincial finance minister would not be responsible to the Subedar. They will be directly responsible to their bosses at the central level. But the powerful nobles, disrupted this practice. Case in point, Bengal. The governor of Bengal first made himself Diwan. He combined the two offices. Similar things were done in other provinces. The Subedar of Awadh said that, look, there are so many agrarian crises in my province that I need more authority to control it. There are so many revolts in my provinces that I need more authority. So in this way, more and more provincial officials, through some intrigue or the other, started the separating away from the center. And this is why here we had said that the relation between This is why we had said the Jagirdari crisis, agrarian crisis, and provincial administration of the empire. There's this unique relation that these two crises, and in fact, to add one more point, prosperity in some provinces. What they did, they hampered the checks and balances. Okay, they hampered the checks and balances that were created by Mughal Badshah. So in this way, by the end of, especially after the death of Aurangzeb, this had happened. See, I am intentionally only briefly mentioning the commercial revolution led by the European companies. It has a very detailed history. See, if you recall, by 1498, Vasco da Gama reached India. Okay, during the 16th century, the Portuguese dominated Indian Ocean trade. But in 17th century, the Dutch East India Company, the British East India Company, the French East India Company, they came and they first replaced Portuguese, and then they interlinked Indian market with Southeast Asian market and Western European market and even New World. In fact, if you recall the Atlantic slave trade, that the European companies used to buy slaves from Africa, sell them to America. So to buy slaves from Africa, they used to buy goods from India and Southeast Asia. So they created a vast global network of trade. So money flowed into India, but only in some provinces. Some other provinces that were disturbed for a very long time, say the Deccan heartland, where due to the persistent struggle between the Mughal Empire and the Maratha Sardars, it did not benefit. But there what happened, that the Maratha Sardars gradually became so powerful that they overthrew Mughals. The prosperity came to Bengal. There the local Subedar, what he did, that he combined the office of Faujdar and Diwan. They gradually threw away all the Mughal Jagirdars to other provinces, so that he could give Jagirdari to his own men in his province. So such, prosperity and, decline, they both acted in tandem to bring the Mughal Empire down. So with this we complete our chapter on Mughal Empire. We will cover the rest of the chapters in next lecture. Thank you.